Recently, I've come across a new type of elitism in the Magic the Gathering world. There are numerous people, there's also different channels that are either directly or more implicitly stating that win more cards are warping the format for the worse. And this isn't really a new concept either. There's dates of articles, Reddit posts, blog posts, and I'm sure in-person discussion dating back to well over 15 years in the past. And that's just what I can find. And you all know and love these cards. After all, they are some of the most pronounced and some of the most famous in our format, and they're up on screen now. But what exactly is a win more card? Simply put, a win more card is one that generally does nothing on its own. It requires prerequisites in order to actually be useful. And if by meeting those prerequisites you otherwise would just be forwarding your game plan, the so-called win more card is just icing on the cake. It's unnecessary. Let's take Anointed Procession as an example. Aside from the grotesque price on this specific token doubler, you're effectively paying 4 mana for a static effect that is wholly dependent on other pieces to make your deck function. And sure, when it works great, often making obscene amounts of rabbits or elves or whatever else you Selesnya players are making these days. But when it doesn't work, or it gets destroyed by something like a much cheaper source that simply outvalues you by the mana difference, you're suddenly stuck. You just took an entire turn off to do something that effectively did nothing. And of course, these types of cards generally need a lot of setup, so using this same exact example, let's run out Anointed Procession to an empty board state because you're just trying to be mana efficient and stay on curve. Now, if you have no other piece to actually enable this card or immediately take advantage of you playing Anointed Procession, you're actively trying to get this piece out on the board to take advantage of it on a later turn. And this is just akin to building the plane as you're trying to fly it. It generally doesn't work out in your favor. And believe me, people will notice these cards the most. There's a reason that there's such a price tag and also a stigma associated with these cards. You cannot leave an Anointed Procession player alone for a single turn because that turn might be your last. And sure, not every single deck is created equal. That same Anointed Procession player in my group, for example, runs a Kadira Caller of the Small list, and it's not really a fully optimized deck. So letting him go for a single turn is really not that big of a deal. It's not going to be the end of the world. But for every single Anointed Procession player that I do know, aka my friend in my group, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of people that I simply don't know. And you cannot let these players just have their way with you. But let's just take a moment and hone in on something. Did you notice my word choice when I was talking about the number of tokens that Anointed Procession makes? Obscene. The word that I used was an obscene number of tokens. Not more than normal, not 1 or 2 extra, obscene, which is just another way of saying often more than necessary. Now, I use this example in another one of my videos, but the difference between 100 tokens and 200 tokens is often negligible because you just need enough to kill the other players. Once you've exceeded that threshold, you no longer need any additional tokens. Now, in certain decks, Anointed Procession works really well, allowing you to sort of keep up and keep pace with the other decks at the table while also taking advantage of those extra tokens that you're making. But for a majority of decks that it's run in, it's simply gluttonous. You're already stuffed full of more than you can need or ever handle. But the desire for more, bigger, flashier things to happen is the siren song that sends you cascading across the rocks. Now, I can think of many other examples of cards like this that would fit in here, but we'd be stuck here discussing these individual cards all day. Things like Nyxbloom Ancient, Doubling Season, Thousand Year Storm. You get the picture. Now, it may not be immediately obvious by the way I've structured the intro to this video, but I actually really love it when other people use these cards. Let me explain. If my opponent casts a Doubling Season on turn 4 with nothing else to back it up, I know that I'm pretty much in the clear for the next 1 or maybe even 2 turn cycles. Everyone at the table is just pitching a fit because, well, that card can't stick around at the table, otherwise it's going to take over the game. And we've all seen this happen, and with the deflected hate, I'm allowed to develop my board, get greedy, ramp more, just generally set myself up to be in a more winning position on later turns of the game. The other players don't need to know that I have an answer sitting in my hand for that Doubling Season. They're simply too distracted by their own panic to see the actual problem at the table. It's me. So maybe instead of being hateful, take a moment and silently thank these players for using these cards at your table. They're giving you an advantage. They're doing you a favor. This is also why I don't understand the level of animosity that surrounds this particular subject of win more cards. I think that people really just need something to be angry about, really. And if you're in the position of understanding that these particular cards are actually a burden or a hindrance to your deck, not only will that improve your deck function by effectively cutting them and putting in more synergistic pieces, but it also allows you to take advantage of this stigma that's associated with these cards at the table. Whenever somebody uses them, immediately they are now the sort of center of attention. Use this to your advantage. Don't be stupid about it. Just be happy that these cards exist. The opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. Honestly, to me, this actually is more of a discussion about why these certain cards have risen to such heights in the first place. Enter the EDHREC effect. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the EDHREC effect details the phenomena of certain cards artificially rising in the ranks on EDHREC, the deck building website. And that's because these cards are sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you go to EDHREC to build your very own unique version of whatever commander you so choose, and you decide to use a majority of the recommendations on EDHREC, and then you want to store your deck somewhere, so you use Moxfield or Archidect, whatever other deck building website you want to use, EDHREC then will look at your deck on Moxfield or Archidect, scrape the data, and then it'll import those card choices onto EDHREC for other people to see. And you could sort of see how this is, like I mentioned, a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you are using cards that are recommended on EDHREC, which ultimately end up in your deck list, and that deck list then just self-reinforces the existing numbers on EDHREC. This is why that you don't see a lot of more niche or interesting includes. It's more generalized cards that people just sort of accept that are good. Now, let me demonstrate how this can actually be problematic. A quick example of how this can be more problematic and self-reinforcing of bad includes is actually with Prosper Tomebound. Let's take a look at Apex of Power in the sorcery category, which shows up in 26% of all Prosper lists. And I think that number is simply criminal. That is way too high. If you exile Apex of Power with Prosper's ability, you're effectively SOL, because that second ability, which states that it must be cast from the hand to add mana to your mana pool, no longer is relevant. And that's the part about this card that is just so crazy. You can't play lands off of it. You have to be casting spells off of Apex of Power. So do you really want to spend a majority of your turn and mana pool casting something which then effectively will do nothing for the rest of your turn? You make a single treasure off of Prosper and then pass a majority of the time. This is just one of those holdover cards that seems so good on paper, and most of the players will simply look at EDHREC and not even think twice about including it, goes in their deck, and then EDHREC will then scrape the data and say, yeah, Apex of Power showed up in another list. It must be a very good synergistic card. And the same thing happens for a majority of our win more cards. They go in all of these decks, and then EDHREC will scrape the data, and then it'll push them higher up in the ranking because, damn, these cards seem really good. They seem very effective for my list. Now, I think that all of this information actually points to a more systemic issue. The addition and perpetual upscaling of these win more cards through this self-reinforced cycle on EDHREC is not just a card-by-card basis. It's developed into its own culture. You can seldom go to a table with someone playing Selesnya tokens and not see the various token doublers that we've mentioned in this video. The very foundation of deck building is largely homogenized, and much of that has to do with the availability of information. And it only makes sense. Do you want to spend 30 plus hours building a deck, reading many thousands of niche cards to find the best ones? Or just go to EDHREC and have all of that information in literal minutes? It's a blessing, but it's also a curse. Now, this is also why in our community, we're more focused on being critically thinking about the deck choices. Does this card actually have merit to be included? Do I really need another token doubler in my deck? Or would it make more sense for me to play protection for my commander or counter magic to ensure that I get to do my strategy in the first place? It's about problem solving your deck and also evaluating what the merits are that would make your deck function better. And although you can save time, you will never find these answers on EDHREC. It's just going to come from up here. One final message that I'll leave you with is this. These win more cards that are so problematic really are not so. They're taking up space on EDHREC, sure, but that's about it. We as a community love buzzwords and creating problems when there really are none. And I think that this is just another example of that. If someone plays them, silently thank them for doing so to allow you to get further ahead and take the heat away from you. And if you're the person who feels like actually these cards are a bigger issue than they really are, maybe the common denominator, which is yourself, needs to evaluate your own deck and shore up its deficiencies before tearing other people down. Let them eat cake or some shit like that. Oh, subscribe to the channel and like the video.